Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today I want to do a starter guide for EmulationStation Desktop Edition on Android. And it's a relatively new frontend. It's been out for about 6 months on Android at this point, but it is far and away my favorite frontend to use with retro handhelds like this that are Android based. And this guide is going to work on anything like a dedicated handheld, but then also a phone or a tablet. Basically anything that runs Android will generally work with EmulationStation. So we'll talk about all the reasons why this one is my favorite, and then of course we're going to set it up and get it all tweaked perfectly. But then I also want to show you how to set up a custom collection, because these can be pretty awesome as well. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so let's start by talking about why I like EmulationStation Desktop Edition so much. There are plenty of good front ends out there available on Android. I've got a couple other favorites, including Daigisho as well as Beacon, but there are things about EmulationStation Desktop Edition that really sets it apart. The first is that this front end is made with controller-focused navigation in mind. After all, this is a port of an app that was already available for Linux and Windows as well as Mac. And so using this front end with a touchscreen-based operating system like Android is really transformative. Another thing that's really transformative about this front end are the various themes that you can use. There are dozens of different options within the front end that you can download directly onto it. And some of these themes can really change the look and feel well beyond any other front ends that I've seen before. Now, in addition to customizing the look and feel via themes, you can also change out these scraping options. And so this is a very robust resource when it comes to adding your own box art and other media. Another thing I like about this one is that it has live content updates. So for example, if you delete out or add in a new Super Nintendo game, the next time you start up EmulationStation, it's going to find those. And so instead of having to manually remove or add games, it's just going to do it on the fly. We also have a lot of customization options within EmulationStation. For example, if you want to use your own custom media, or you want to add in an emulator that isn't listed previously, it's pretty easy. In fact, in this video, we're going to do that with the Nintendo Switch emulators. Another factor that's really helpful for me is that the data is transferable. So if you set up EmulationStation, you have it all pointed to your SD card, you can actually use that SD card in other devices and then reinstall EmulationStation, and it's going to save all of your work. This means that if you have a standardized way of saving everything, like we're going to be doing in this video, that means that the next time you put it in a new device, it's going to remember all of your scraped media and all of your other organization. And even though this app has only been out for about 6 months at this point, it is regularly updated, and we've seen some pretty significant changes. In fact, there have been so many updates, that's one of the reasons why I'm making this guide right now, because my other ones are a little bit out of date. And then finally, even though this is a paid app, I find it to be very inexpensive. It's a $5.50 one-time purchase. And I think it's a very reasonable price for all of the additional functionality that we're going to be getting with our retro handheld. Now, as we get started here, I'm going to assume that you have already set up your Android-based device. I've got a bunch of different guides depending on the different handheld that you have, but I would recommend my most recent one, which would be the Retro Pocket 4 and 4 Pro Starter Guide. And so this will show you how to download and install all of your emulators, so we're not going to focus on this in this video. Instead, we're going to be looking at the last step of the entire starter guide process, which is setting up a front end. In other words, if you have not set up your device just yet, there is a little bit of work that needs to be done before starting this video, and I'll leave my starter guide link down below. So let's go ahead and start by installing EmulationStation Desktop Edition for Android. And I'm actually going to do most of this work directly on my device, but via screen capture, and so it's going to be on my actual Retro Pocket 4 Pro. So to start, you want to go to the website, which I'll have linked in the video description, which is es-de.org. Once you're there, click on the top tab that says Download. And within this section, you will see there are 3 different Android options. Now, if your device has access to the Galaxy Store, the Huawei App Gallery, then you can follow those links. But I think the majority of the people are probably going to be just sideloading this themselves. Unfortunately, this app requires specific permissions that they weren't allowed to get on the Google Play Store, and so as a result, you have to get this via Patreon. But thankfully, it is a very easy process, so just click on that Patreon link, and then it'll walk you through the process of signing up. Now, at its core, Patreon is meant to be for a monthly subscription, but that's not how EmulationStation Desktop Edition works. Instead, you only have to join for that first month, which is going to be $5.50. After you've signed up and made that first payment, you can then cancel out of your account, but you will continue to get future updates via email. So even though Patreon is a monthly subscription, this is a one-time purchase. Anyway, I'm not going to walk you through the sign-up process just because I don't want to show off my credit card information, but once you've joined up and signed in, you can then then go to the front page of EmulationStation Desktop Edition, and under their recent post, you should see their most recent release. As of making this video, it is 3.1.0-32. This update added translations for 10 new languages, and so if you are not a primary English speaker, you might have support here. Regardless, once you've found that most recent post, then just find the download link and click on that. From there, you'll be prompted to download the file, and yeah, go ahead and do it. After that, go into your downloads folder and you should find that APK. Go ahead and click on it. It's going to ask, do you really want to install this app? And you're going to say, yeah, man, I want to do it. And so here we are on my Retroid front page, and you can see I have ESDE right here on the top left. And as a reminder, I've already set up this device, so if I swipe over, you can see that I have all of my different emulators, and I also have other games installed. So again, I'm assuming that you have already set up your device to be able to play your favorite retro games. Anyway, let's go ahead and start configuring EmulationStation. So let's start up the app. And first thing, it's going to ask for some access permissions. Go ahead and click on continue. And then you'll get another prompt to open up the permissions screen and then turn this on. From there, it's going to ask you to select your application data directory. And this is where you're going to keep all of your different settings and scrape media, and so this is really important. Now, by default, it's going to try to save it on your internal storage, but if you're like me and using a retro handheld, chances are you want to save it on an SD card in case you want to use it with a different handheld later on. So instead of using the default directory, which is ESDE on the device itself, we're going to click that hamburger menu bar on the top left, and then we're going to select our SD card. Now from there, we need to make our own folder, which is where we're going to put all of that application data. And you can name this whatever you want, but I would recommend ESDE. Either with or without the dash, it's totally up to you. For the best results, probably put in that dash, but I forgot to while filming this footage. Anyway, once you've made that folder within your SD card, go ahead and select Use this folder, and then click Allow. Now on the next screen, it's going to ask you to set your ROMs directory, and this is very similar to the app directory we just set up. The big difference here is this is going to be where your games are going to be located. Again, by default, it's going to want to put it on your internal storage, but also again, we're going to use our SD card. So same process here. We're going to click on select directory, then go up to that hamburger menu and pick our SD card. Now we need to create a new folder, and this time we're going to call it ROMs. By default, I would recommend capital ROM and then lowercase s. And again, same thing here. Once you've made that folder, go ahead and click on use this folder, and we are now good to go. Now the last thing is it's going to ask to create system directories. Now essentially this is going to be creating subfolders within your ROMs folder for each of the different consoles that you could play via EmulationStation. And so it's going to ask for you to create these directories, and I recommend that you do that just to make everything very seamless. And after that, we're going to get a notice that setup is complete, so let's click on the I understand, and that'll bring us to the front end menu. Now, when you first get to this front page, you're not going to be able to see anything, and that's because we haven't added our games just yet. After all, at this point, all we've done is added our subfolders within the ROMs folder, so now we have to actually move over our files. So we're going to quit out of EmulationStation, and if I go into my Files app and then go to the SD card and then that ROMs folder, you can see that, yeah, we've got a bunch of folders here now. And so this is where we need to put the ROM files for each of our systems into that corresponding folder. Now you've got a couple different ways that you can do this. For example, if you've already set up your device and you have your games stored somewhere else on your SD card or internally, then you can move them over to these folders. Or if you haven't moved over any game files just yet, then you can do that now as well. So I'm going to take out my SD card and I'm going to put it into my computer, and then we're going to actually add those files via here just because it's going to look a little bit easier. So here's my setup. On the left side, I've got my Android SD card. So you can see I have that ROMs folder as well as the ESD folder that we created earlier. Now I don't have any games on this card at all. This is a brand new card. But on the right side, you can see that I've plugged in my external drive with all of my own ROMs. So the idea here is that on the left side, I'm going to go into whatever folder it is that I want to add games, and then on the right side, I'm going to drag my games over onto the left. And this is really just a drag and drop process at this point. Just grab your ROMs and put them into the corresponding folder. And if you're brand new to emulation, you might be wondering, where do you get these ROM files in the first place? And of course, I'm not going to be able to show you that. After all, these are copyrighted files, but you can probably figure that out on your own. Either way, once you're done moving over all of your files, we are now ready to start the actual setup of EmulationStation. So I'm going to take out my SD card, put it back into my device, and now I'm going to open up ESDE. Now this time when we open it up, you can see there are a bunch of different systems listed, and that is because we've added game files into those folders. Now the first thing I always like to do when starting up ESDE for the first time is I press Start to get into the main menu, and then I go down to Input Device Settings, and then I turn off the Enable Touch Overlay. Because all of the devices that I'm using already have their own controls, I don't need touchscreen controls, so this is all going to be up to you. Now when you select this, it is going to give you a warning and saying that, hey, if you're like using a phone and you turn this off, you'll have to plug in a controller in order to get this to work. Either way, here we are. I can navigate through all my systems, I can press the A button to bring up the games list, and then theoretically I can launch them from here. However, we do have a couple other steps we need to do in order to make sure that this works seamlessly. So first thing, we'll press start to get into the main menu and then go into other settings. From there, the first option says alternative emulators. And within here, we can choose whatever emulator we want to launch each specific system. And they already have a bunch selected by default, but some of these may not correspond to what you want to actually use. For example, my arcade ROM set is not MAME current, but rather MAME 2003 Plus. So I can go within here and then change it out to the emulator that'll work with my own ROM set. And for the most part, if you just see the name of an emulator or a core, that generally means it's going to be within RetroArch. And that can be good for some systems, but bad for others. For example, with GameCube, it's going to default to the Dolphin RetroArch core. But me personally, I prefer to use the standalone emulator, so I'm going to change that over. And so essentially, you just need to go through this one time and then pick the emulator that you're actually going to be using with that system. And there are a couple things to note. For example, it's only going to show Aether SX2 for PS2, but that is also going to work with Neether SX2, which is the emulator I recommend. Either way, once you've got this all configured to your liking, this is going to help a lot when it comes to launching your games. But there are a couple things you should do on the emulator side as well, just to make sure that everything works. So let's start with RetroArch. This is probably going to be the main thing that you're using, especially for retro games. So the number one thing here is you need to make sure that the cores that you are pointing to in EmulationStation are actually downloaded within RetroArch. So the easiest way to do that is to go into the main settings, go into Online Updater, and then find Core Downloader. And within here, just make sure you've downloaded all of the cores that you're trying to launch within EmulationStation. And you'll know it's installed if you already have a little hash symbol to the right of the core name. And so for my part, I have already set all of this stuff up. I did that a long time ago when setting up this device initially. So really, I'm just going through and confirming that I have all of these downloaded. So let's say that you have all of your RetroArch emulator cores set up and you've also got them pointed correctly. So let's go back into EmulationStation and start up a game that runs via RetroArch. Let's go over to Game Boy Advance, which I have set up to run via the MGBA emulator core in RetroArch. And sure enough, when I start up a game, it starts up RetroArch and all my configurations are already set up. And again, I already did this previously as part of the whole starter guide for the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. So as far as RetroArch goes, that's about all you have to do. Now when it comes to standalone emulators, you will have to make an additional configuration, but this is also pretty easy. Let's try out Nintendo GameCube, which is going to be launching via Dolphin Standalone. If I try to launch a game, you can see that nothing really happens. That's because the app itself needs to know where the games are located. So let's quit out of EmulationStation Desktop Edition and go into Dolphin. And sure enough, when opening up this app, you can see that no games are listed. So let's go ahead and point them to that ROMs folder that we set up earlier. We're going to click on the Add Games button, and then we're going to navigate to our ROMs folder on the SD card. Once we're there, we're going to navigate down to the GameCube folder. It's going to be under the folder named GC. Once you're in that folder, select Use This Folder. It's going to ask, do you really want to do this? And you're going to say, yeah, man, I want to do it. And now from there, under the GameCube tab, you can see that I have all of my GameCube games. While we're here, let's go ahead and do it for Nintendo Wii as well, since this works with the same emulator. Again, I'll go back to Add Games, and then go into the ROMs folder, find that Wii folder, and then use this folder. And that's all you have to do with these standalone emulators. You need to make sure that they're pointing to that new ROMs directory that we set up when setting up EmulationStation. So let's now go back into the front end app and then go into the GameCube section and try to start up that same game. And look at that, sure enough, it does boot into the game directly. In fact, I've even got the GameCube boot logo, which is something I have a video guide for as well. And so essentially that's all you're going to need to do with these standalone emulators. You have to open them up on their own and then point them to the correct ROM folder. And once you've set that up between RetroArch and these standalone emulators, you can essentially just start up any game at that point. So let's move into some of the other elements that might give you some trouble as you start getting set up. For example, let's start by talking about Nintendo 3DS. Now this one gives you a bunch of different emulator options. For me personally, I prefer to use Lime 3DS. That's the one that's been most recently updated, and so I usually will point to that one. However, if you try to add a Nintendo Switch game on here, you may see that if you go into the alternative emulators, there are no options for Nintendo Switch at all. And that's because after the whole Yuzu takedown earlier this year, the EmulationStation developer just removed all traces of Yuzu from their code. And so by default, the only app that's going to work within EmulationStation is going to be Skyline, which is a much older emulator. However, one of the great things about EmulationStation is how customizable it is, and so we're going to add some custom systems that'll allow us to launch Yuzu on Android. We're going to use this tool, which I'll have linked down in the video description, which is called ESDE Android Custom Systems. And this code is going to add all of our Nintendo Switch emulator options, but then also a bunch of hacks for older systems as well. And setting this up is super easy. In the file listing, you can see there are two XML files. Just go ahead and click click on one of those, it's going to bring up the file page. And then if you scroll down a bit, on the right side, you will see a down arrow and it'll say download raw file. Just go ahead and tap on that and it's going to download this XML file. It's going to be a very small file, about 2 kilobytes. Now just go back to that main file listing again and then click on the other XML file and then do the exact same thing. Download that raw file. Once you have these downloaded, you can exit out of your browser and then go into your file management app. Now, under your downloads folder, you should find those 2 XML files. Go ahead and long press on one of them, which is going to select it, and then press on the other one to check them both. Now, on the top right, select Move To, and then on the following page, click the hamburger bar, then the SD card, and then go into the ESD folder. Within here, you'll find a folder that says Custom Systems. Open that up. And now on the bottom left, click on that Move button. That's going to move these 2 XML files into this folder. And that's all you have to do. We have now added in those Nintendo Switch emulators. So let's open up EmulationStation Desktop Edition again. Now let's press Start to get into the main menu, then go into Other Settings, Alternative Emulators. And now as we scroll down to the bottom, you can see that yes, we've got a bunch of Nintendo Switch emulator options. So depending on the app that you prefer to use, I'm just using the Yuzu standalone right now, you're going to have a bunch of extra options. Okay, so at this point, we are basically good when it comes to emulation, but there's one other thing I want to add, and that's going to be all of our Android apps. Now, this is something the EmulationStation developer is working on, but it might be some time before it actually gets updated. However, in the meantime, there is a third-party app that will basically get the job done, so we're going to use that instead for this video. And this app is called ES App Launcher, and I'll have it also linked down in the video description. Now, this one is essentially just a regular old Android app, and so it's very easy to install. Just scroll down a bit until the Releases tab and then click on the latest release, and then you should see the APK. Just tap on that. From there, you'll be prompted to download the file and go ahead and do that. Once it's been downloaded, just install it like any other app and you'll be good to go. So here we are with the app on the left side. Let's go ahead and open it up. And this is what the main menu will look like. And so essentially we are going to go through each one of these apps and then choose how to categorize it. If it's an app that you don't want to see at all, just go ahead and click on the disable thing on the far right. If it's a game, just tap on the one that says game. Now, if you run into one that you want to just treat as an app, neither a game nor an emulator, or disable it, then just leave it unchecked. So for example, here with the Chrome browser, I'm just going to leave it as it is. And really, that's all you have to do with this program. Just go through and categorize each of your apps, either as a game or an emulator or an app, or just disable it. It might get a little bit tricky with certain categories. For example, with game streaming, I usually will associate these as being a game as opposed to an emulator or an app. But of course, that's all going to be totally up to you and whatever you're most comfortable with. Anyway, once you've done all of that, we now need to save this configuration. To do that, on the top right, just tap on that little save icon. From there, it'll bring up a file browser. So now navigate to your SD card and then go into your ROMs folder. And once you see all of your different subfolders for all the other systems, click on Use This Folder. And this is going to allow the app to be able to paste all of the different configurations that we already set up. The first time you do it, it is going to give you an access file permission toggle, so turn this on. And after that, you're good to go. If you ever want to change out any of these configurations, just click that save button again and then do this all over again. So now let's go back into EmulationStation and see how this works. And sure enough, as you can see right here front and center, we have the Android app section. We've also got an Android games section with an Odin 2, very nice looking. And then we also have the emulator section. Now, if we go into one of these, like Android apps, you can see that everything we categorized as just being an app is now listed here. Same thing with our Android games and of course our emulators. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's go into Android games and then pick a random game. And sure enough, when we try to launch this, it's going to launch the entire game. Now, one thing worth noting, don't uninstall that ES App Launcher app once you've got this all set up, because it is necessary to launch each of these things. Either way, let's go ahead and try this out with an emulator now. So we're going to go into the emulator section. Let's pick the PSP one and then try this here. And yeah, sure enough, we were able to launch directly into our emulator from EmulationStation. That's awesome. Okay, so now in terms of functionality, I think we've got everything taken care of. Next, I want to make everything as pretty as possible. We're going to start by changing out themes, because I think this is probably one of the most transformative things you can do within EmulationStation. Now, setting this up is super easy. Just make sure your device is connected to the internet, then go into Main Menu and then UI Settings. The top option is called Theme Downloader. If you click on that, it's going to give you a quick warning. It's basically just saying that it's going to be a little bit slow that first time. Anyway, after it's loaded, you can now navigate through all your different theme options and then choose them from here. And these themes are updated all the time, so make sure that you check back often. Anyway, if you like the look of one of these, just go ahead and click on it and it'll start the download process. And it might take, a few seconds, upwards of a minute just to download everything. And of course, you can just download a bunch of these at one time, whatever you like. Anyway, once you've got some downloaded, let's go back into the UI settings section and now go into theme. And so here's a list of all the themes that we have now downloaded. We're going to pick this top one, Electful NX Revisited. Once you have that selected, just press the B button a couple times to get back to the main menu. It might take a second, but once it shifts over, you can now see that we have an entirely different theme. Now, the cool thing about these themes is that there are a bunch of different configurations you can do for each of them. So let's go back into UI settings, and now under theme color scheme, let's change this from light to dark. Also, while we're in here, let's change the theme font size. I found that I always want them to be larger on these smaller handhelds. So now let's back out again, and you can see here, sure enough, we now have a dark theme around our image. And if we go into any of these games lists, you can see that the font is pretty large as well, so I think this is great. Now at this point, I would recommend you just experiment, try out a bunch of themes and see which ones you like the best. For example, let's go back into the theme section and we'll pick a different one. This time, let's try Game OS. And again, we'll just back out to the main menu, and here we are. It looks completely different. Not only can you navigate left and right between your systems, but you can go up and down for the different rows. And so this one already feels different than the Electful one that we were just using. Now, if you want a different navigation experience, I would recommend this one. It's called Canvas. This one will give you just a bunch of icons that you can move across, and I think this is pretty cool too. And like with the others, you can change the configuration to suit your needs. For example, if we go back into the UI settings and then under this theme, under theme variant, you can see we have a bunch of different options. I'd recommend experimenting with these. And there's a bunch of different color schemes, including the type of icons that will show when you're navigating through. As an example, let's go to Icon and Retro and then back out to the main menu. And now you can see that instead of showing like game artwork, it's actually just showing icons of each of these systems. And of course, we now have that retro background as well. So really, when it comes down to it, sky's the limit when it comes to these themes. Just go ahead and try some out and see which ones you like. You've got everything from super minimal ones like this one called Escape, which really is just text-oriented. Or you have this one called Horizon, which I think fits really well if you're going to have a retro-focused machine, just because it is kind of a retro-style UI. Either way, for the rest of the video, we're going to use this one. It's called Iconic, and I'm using the dark version of the theme. I think it looks really good. Now, one last note about themes. I recommend going into the UI settings and then the theme downloader and re-downloading your themes from time to time. And that's because these themes are constantly being updated. And so even if you already are happy with your theme, if you re-download it, you might get additional features that you didn't even know you had. Now, because we just downloaded these themes, there are no updates available, but I would recommend doing this maybe once a month or so. Okay, so now that we've got a nice theme and everything's looking pretty good, let's now change out our game media. This is going to be a process called scraping, which is going to add our box art and videos and things like that. So let's press the start button, get into the main menu, and go into the first section called Scraper. Now you've got two different options to scrape from, Screen Scraper and Games Database. We're going to go with Screen Scraper right now. Now in the third section, it'll say scrape these systems, and you can choose whatever you would like, either all of them or none of them. We're just going to pick one system for now, and that's going to be Nintendo 64. So I'm just going to click on that and then go back. Now, under account settings, we want to add our username and password from screenscraper.fr. This is totally free, but if you're going to be using Screenscraper, which is what I recommend, then you are going to have to set this up. So if you don't have these credentials already, just go to that website and sign up for a new account. Next, under content settings, it's going to ask what things do you want to download. By default, they're all going to be turned on. And I'd say for the most part, yeah, you can download everything. The only thing that I would give a little bit of caution to is the bottom one, game manuals. Now, honestly, showing the game manuals in Emulation Station is really awesome, and so one of my favorite features, but these files are very large. So if you are limited on space, or maybe you don't want to scrape all day, then you maybe want to turn this one off. Now again, I think the game manuals really enhance that experience, but if you are trying to save space and time, this is the one I would recommend turning off. Okay, in the next section we have the mix image settings, and I don't recommend changing any of these. I think the defaults are perfect. And then finally we have our other settings, and within here I only recommend changing out the region to correspond to wherever you live. From there, we're good to go. Let's click on the start button, and then it's going to start the scraping process, but only for Nintendo 64. That's the only one we checked. And you can see that I have 45 games here, and it'll take a few seconds per game, so this might take several minutes altogether. I'm going to use the magic of television to just fast forward all of this, but when you're done, it'll say that a bunch of games are now scraped. And now once we click on OK, you can see that, yeah, we've got a bunch of box art for Nintendo 64 games. And it's a combination of the box art and the title and the screenshot. All of it looks very good. This is the mix image. And if we hover over the game for a second, you will see that a video will start playing as well. This is all part of that scraping and downloading process. Another thing you may notice is the videos are playing with game audio, and you may or may not want that. So let me show you really quickly how to change that out if you'd like. Back in the main menu, if you go into sound settings, there's a bunch of different toggles. And so here you can turn off the audio while the media viewer is playing videos, or even when the screensaver is also playing. We'll do that in a second. And if you want to turn off the sounds while navigating through Emulation Station, you can do that here as well. And so now with these turned off, if we go back into the Nintendo 64 section and hover over a game again, now when the video plays, there's not going to be any audio. And so this might be just a little bit more peaceful of an experience for you. Now earlier I mentioned screensavers, so let's talk a little bit about this. And this is a feature that's already baked into Emulation Station. In fact, on the bottom of the main menu, you will see that there's a button that corresponds to turning on the screensaver. And it's going to be the button on the left. That could be X or Y depending on the setup of your handheld. So let's go ahead and press that button, and you can see that it immediately starts a screensaver of the different videos that we scraped previously. Now right now we've only scraped Nintendo 64, so that's all that's going to show up. And these games are going to show up randomly, and if you press right on the D-pad, it's actually going to cycle through them. And if you find a game that you want to actually play, you can press the bottom button, which will usually be A or B, and that will launch the game. And so this has always been one of my favorite features. It's going to cycle through all of your games, and then randomly you might find one you really like, and then you can play it. Okay, so now let's go ahead and scrape the rest of the systems, and this is going to be a very big project, but let's do it all at once. So back in that scraper menu, the first thing I recommend doing is going into the Scrape These Games section. And by default, it's just going to scrape every game, even those that have already been scraped. We're going to choose no metadata. That means that if the game has not been scraped, it's going to be scraped, but if it has, it's going to be skipped over. This will save you a lot of time in the long run. Now, we're going to go into Scrape These Systems, and we're going to select all of them. So we'll go down to the very bottom, and there's an option that says Select All, so we'll pick that. However, I know for a fact that the Android apps and games and emulators will not properly scrape with Screen Scraper, so we're going to turn those off. But otherwise, we're going to leave everything else on. After we've got that set up, we're just going to click on Start, and now it's going to scrape through all the games I have installed, which is 811. And this can take quite some time. In fact, for me, it took about 2 hours. So one of the things you may want to do, especially if you have an OLED display, is swipe down from the top, and then turn down the brightness of your screen all the way. That way you're not going to get any risk of burn-in. Anyway, that is one handy trick to be able to scrape through all of your systems without having any of that risk. Now again, I'm just going to fast forward through all of this, and so here I am 2 hours later, and you can see that it says that 788 games scraped, but 23 of them were skipped. And that's because I do have quite a few games that are like ROM hacks or just aren't named correctly. And so if we scroll through, you can see that, yeah, the vast majority of these games are now working properly. We can see all of the box art, everything looks great. But if we scroll down to Super Nintendo, I know I've got a few issues here. For example, under Final Fantasy VI, you can see that I'm using a ROM hack, and this one was not picked up by Screen Scraper. So what I want to do here is I want to re-scrape this one individually. To do that, you want to hover over the game, then press Select or Back. That's going to bring up the game list options. From here, scroll down to Edit this game's metadata, and then I press R2 to go all the way down to the bottom, and then I select Scrape. Now at this point, it's going to search through Screen Scraper again to try to find that game. And as expected, it doesn't know what to do. It's saying no games found. So now we're going to click on the Refine search here at the bottom. And you can see here the problem is the fact that it says bug fixes and add-ons, so I need to remove that. So instead, I'm just going to search for the words Final Fantasy VI. And sure enough, a bunch of options show up, including Final Fantasy III, which was the name of this game in North America. So to make things easy, I'm just going to click on that one, and that's going to re-scrape this game, but with the Final Fantasy III artwork. And after a second, it's going to download all that stuff, and sure enough, if we now go into the games list, you can see Final Fantasy III, and we've got all of the metadata as well as the artwork. So there are going to be some games here or there where you may have to do this. Let's do a couple other options. For example, with this list of Super Nintendo games, I have 2 versions of Super Mario World. I've got just the standard 4x3 version, but then also I've got a widescreen hack that I set up. And of course, I've got a video guide about that as well. I think I'll just leave all this stuff linked down below. Either way, you can see that the widescreen version of the game just doesn't show up. It doesn't know what to do. So for this one, we're going to get a little bit creative. We're going to go back and scrape this one again, but now I'm just going to search for the word Super Mario World. So I'm going to take out the word wide. And sure enough, it's just going to have the original Super Mario World game. I am good with this. So I'm just going to click on that. It's going to download that metadata. However, I want to make sure that I separate this one from the other non-widescreen version. So I'm going to scroll up to the top of the Edit Metadata section, and I'm going to change the name. And here I'm just going to put at the end in parentheses the word widescreen. And now back in that same edit metadata section, I'm going to save the game. And when I navigate through, you can see I have 2 entries for Super Mario World, the regular one and then widescreen. The box art and everything is going to be the same, but again, I'm cool with that. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that the widescreen version of this game in particular cannot use the default SNES 9X emulator core. This one has to use a special emulator, and I think this is a great opportunity to show how you can change this up by game. Again, we'll press the select button to get to the game list options and then edit this game's metadata. And then we'll press R2 again to get to the bottom, and then under alternative emulator, we're going to change it. Instead of the default SNES 9X current, we're going to change it to BSNES HD. And this one's required for a lot of the widescreen Super Nintendo hacked games. From there, I'm going to press the save button. And now when I try to launch this game, you can see that, yeah, it's launching in widescreen. So that game is now up and working. Let's go ahead and test it with the regular Super Mario World as well to make sure that this one is working and of course not in widescreen. And yeah, sure enough, when starting this one up, we have the standard 4x3 version as well. Let's do this one more time just to make sure you get the hang of it. So let's do this with Super Metroid because I have a widescreen hack of this one as well. Now by default, these both already say Super Metroid, so now I have to figure out which one is which. Thankfully, this is also pretty easy, so I can pick one of them, press select, and then go into the edit this game's metadata. And then up at the top, you can see that it says the name of the file, and this one says Super Metroid Wide, so this one obviously is the widescreen version. So that's pretty easy. All we have to do at this point is just change the name to make sure that I know this one's the widescreen one. Again, I'll just add that widescreen, and then I'll change out the alternative emulator to the BSNES one, and we are now good to go. And so there we go. We not only have changed out the name of these games, we've also scraped them individually and also changed out the emulators that they run. So there's a lot of things you can do within Emulation Station to customize this experience. Let's do one last scraping example in case Screen Scraper is not really working out for you. This time we're going to go into PS1, and under here you can see I have PlayStation Pics. This is an old demo disc that used to ship with the PS1, and I've got a soft spot in my heart for it, so I love playing this demo. But as you can see, Screen Scraper did not scrape any of the data for it. So let's try to scrape it individually first. We're going to press select, edit this game's metadata, then we'll go down to the bottom and select scrape. Now, strangely, when we try to actually scrape it individually, it does show up here with Screen Scraper. However, you can see that it just has the text, no box art or anything else. Either way, let's go ahead and pick this because at least we can get the text here. However, there is one other database we can use to scrape with, and that's going to be that games database one. So let's change that out really quickly. We're going to press start, go into scraper, and then change it from scrape from with Screen Scraper over to game database. Now we're going to do that exact same thing and try to scrape this game individually. We'll press select and then go into the scrape section. Now this time it does show the game with a little bit different of a text, but with more information and then also the box art. One thing worth noting is that games database does not host any sort of video files, so you're not going to be able to use it for that. But at the very least, some box art is better than none, and so we're going to pick this one this time. Now, after we save it, you can see that, yeah, we at least have the PlayStation Pics demo disc. It's not a perfect solution, but I still think that this is better than having nothing at all. Okay, so now that we've set up our media for all of our emulated games, let's now talk about setting this up for Android apps and games in our emulators. This is not going to be a very straightforward process. You know, the best way to do it is to add them all manually, but that's a more advanced topic. Instead, I'm going to show you the easiest way to at least get something there that looks better than nothing. For this, we're going to go back into the ES App Launcher, and this time we're going to set up the media at least as much as we can. So under Media Directory, we're going to change this to Mix Images, because that's the default that we have set up right now. Once you have that, you're going to click on the little picture icon also near the top right. It's also going to bring up a file browser, but this time we're going to go into the ESDE folder, not the ROMs folder. So we'll go into our SD card, then ESDE, and this time we're going to select the folder that says Downloaded Media. Once you're in this folder, click on the thing that says Use this folder at the bottom. It's going to ask, do you really want to allow it? You know what to do. And honestly, that's all you have to do. So what it's doing is taking the image from your app and then making it an actual image within Emulation Station. It's not going to be super high resolution, it's not going to have videos, but at least it's going to show something. So if we go back into Emulation Station and then we go into Android apps, you can see that, yeah, sure enough, we at least have the app icons to see. And this will work for your Android apps as well as your games and your emulators. And I think this is at least better than nothing. Okay, so at this point, we have now set up all of our customization to be able to launch all of our games, and we also have it looking as pretty as possible. So I think at this point, you're probably ready to make this your home app. That means that when you start up your system, it's going to go directly into Emulation Station. And thankfully, this is also super easy. So go back to your main menu within your Android device and go into Settings. Now scroll down to Apps, and then find the one that says Default Apps. There's going to be an option that says Home App. Go into here, and then click on ESDE. And honestly, that's all you have to do. From now on, anytime you start up your system, it's going to go directly into ESDE every time. And provided that you set up all of your Android apps and games and emulators, you should be able to get to whatever you want within your system, even if ESDE is your home app. And so now if you ever need to do anything Android-y, you can just access it via Android apps or Android games. For example, under my app section, I've got a browser, I've got Google Drive, I have the ES app launcher if I ever need to add anything, and I've also got a file browser in the Google Play Store and even the settings menu, so I can basically get anywhere from within Emulation Station. So I think at this point we are relatively good to go when it comes to your initial setup and getting everything streamlined within Emulation Station. Now before we close out, I have one other thing I want to do. It's a little bit more on the advanced side, but I find it to be completely fascinating. And so here we're going to set up custom collections, so we can set this up to be whatever we would like. To do this, we're going to go into the main menu and then go under the game collection settings. Now you've got a bunch of different options here, including an automatic game collection. That's where you would set up, for example, your favorites. And there are some themes that even have their own custom collections, but we're going to make our own from scratch. So we're going to select create new custom collection. It's going to ask us to create a name. And of course, you can name this whatever you would like, and it's all going to be based on whatever collection you're making. So I'm going to make a collection called platformers. But of course, you could do this with role-playing games or first-person shooters, or you could do it by franchise, like all the Mega Man games or Metroid and so on. Either way, for this example, we're going to do platformers, and we'll hit OK. And once that happens, you're going to see a little bit of text at the top that's going to say Editing Platformers Collection and add and remove games with the Y button. And so at this point, it's basically like shopping. We're going to go through each of our systems and then pick any game that we would consider to be a platformer. So let's go into Android games first, and we don't have a lot of options here, but I would say that Braid is a platformer, and then maybe Sonic Mania Plus. So I'm going to pick each of those games, and then I'm going to go on to the next one. And of course, you can pick whatever game, as many or as few as you would like. And so let's go ahead and pick Mario 3, and then also Ninja Gaiden. Over in Game Boy, let's grab Donkey Kong Land. In Game Boy Advance, let's grab Sonic Advance 2. Either way, you get the point. You can just kind of go through each of these systems and then press the Y button every time that you want to add the game to that collection. Now once you're done with that shopping process, you can press the Start button, go back into Game Collection Settings, and then at the very top it'll say Finish Editing Platformers Collection. We're going to press the A button here, and that's going to finish everything out. And so now if we scroll over to that collection section, you'll see that there is one now called Platformers. And sure enough, all those games that we picked earlier are now showing, and they're all in alphabetical order. This is amazing. And so again, sky's the limit when it comes to this. You could make any sort of collection, 3D platformers versus 2D platformers, or maybe there's like 5 games that you really need to play through and you want to put them in a must-have collection. Regardless, I love the amount of freedom that this gives us within Emulation Station. Now let's say later down the line you want to edit this collection. That's also super simple. From here, go into the collections section, then hover over the collection you want to edit. Now press the select button and you'll see there's now an option that says add or remove games to this collection. And I'm sure you know exactly what to do. If we pick this, that means that we can now add or remove whatever game we would like. And once you're done doing that, you can press the select button again and then select Finish Editing Platformers Collection. And so there we go. That's an easy way to be able to curate this on the fly. Okay, I've got one last feature to show you. This is the icing on the cake when it comes to EmulationStation Desktop Edition on Android, because you can take your SD card and put it in another device and it's still going to work and carry over all of your data. So let's do a hypothetical where you have your Retroid Pocket 4 Pro and you decide to upgrade to something else, say for example the Odin 2 Mini. And because we have all of our games and Emulation Station data on the SD card, we're just going to transfer it from this one over to this. So here's my 256GB card from the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, and now I'm going to insert it into my Odin 2 Mini. Now, of course, you still have to set up the Odin 2 Mini, so you've got to install all of your emulators and apps and everything else. That all still needs to happen just inherently with any Android device. And of course, you'll want to install ESDE as well as the app launcher, so you're going to have all that stuff as well. But here's where it gets really cool. When we open up ESDE, it's going to start up the setup process, and we're just going to go through it like we did previously, make sure that all the permissions are granted, and then when we select our directory, now we're going to go to our SD card. And as you probably remember, we have that ESDE app data folder. So I'm going to go in here and then select use this folder. Same thing with the ROMs directory. I'm going to point it to the one on our SD card that we created earlier in this video. So again, I'll just go into ROMs and then use this folder and then allow. Now it is going to ask for you to create your system directories, but we already did that. So I'm just going to hit skip. And then at that point, the setup is complete. We're going to click I understand. Now, when you launch the app, it's actually going to look like it did previously before we set everything up, like we have the on-screen controls. But that's because this data is actually saved internally on the device. So we can just go in here, turn off the input device settings, and then under enable touch overlay, we can, just turn that one off and all is good. So the only thing that really doesn't carry over are your themes. You're going to have to re-download those themes. But as you can already see, we have all of our games listed here. And if we go inside, you can see all of our box art is already scraped. So again, we'll just go into Theme Downloader and download whatever themes that we want. And so just like that, we've got EmulationStation Desktop Edition now working on the Odin 2 Mini. That only took about 2 or 3 minutes. And I love the fact that all of the scraped media is still here, so I don't have to go through that process another time. Okay, so that's really about it when it comes to this video. I wanted to walk you through the entire setup process of EmulationStation from start to finish. And if you run into any issues either during or after this entire setup, I would recommend checking out the ESDE frontend documentation. There's an entire page dedicated to the Android app itself. It'll walk you through the entire setup, and it'll even list out every single recommended emulator and any sort of settings that might need to be tweaked. In addition, there's an entire frequently asked questions page just for the Android app as well. And a ton of work has been put into this FAQ, so if you run into any issues, chances are the answers are here. In addition, there's also just a general EmulationStation Desktop Edition front-end user guide. And this will apply to all the various builds of EmulationStation, Windows, Mac, Linux, as well as Android. And so if you really want to get into the weeds, like making your own custom collections and artwork and things like that, this is what I would recommend checking out. Because even though this was a pretty in-depth guide, I kind of just scraped the surface of all the things that you can do with this app. And so at this point, I think you can probably see why this one is my favorite. I think there's just a ton of customizability options and you can get as deep as you would like. But the beauty of it is that it also just kind of works, and I think this is probably one of the most transformative apps I've ever seen on Android. Either way, I'll have links to all this stuff in the video description, and let me know if you have any questions or comments down below. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.